Now, were Washington with us today, I suspect he would heartily enjoy and endorse the title Call Sign Chaos. When George Washington took over the command of the American Army back in 1775, there literally was chaos. The opposing force, the British Army, was the largest in the world. In the 13 colonies, there was no real American army. There was nothing more than a ragtag band of civilians, untrained, undisciplined, with no uniforms and few supplies. It took painstaking work, dedication, and perseverance, 8 years away from Mount Vernon, to win that war and to then go on to create the American nation. And in that time, Washington learned to lead in a way that has few equals in the history of mankind. That is why we are so pleased, and I am so honored today, to introduce our special guest, General James Mattis, the 26th Secretary of Defense, to share with us his remarkable story of leadership from 18-year-old recruit in the Marine Corps Reserve to 4-star general. We especially like his subtitle, Learning to Lead, because we here at Mount Vernon are helping others learn to lead, sharing George Washington's leadership skills with corporate, government, and nonprofit bodies around the country through our Leadership Institute and through discussions such as this one today. We look forward to hearing General Mattis share insights about his career, the lessons he has learned through service in Iraq and Afghanistan, leadership in 3 wars, including leadership of the U.S. Central Command, where he directed 250,000 troops across the Middle East. This conversation could not be more timely. Helping to facilitate the discussion today in what is sure to be a lively colloquy is Mount Vernon's own President and CEO, Dr. Doug Bradburn. Join me in a warm welcome for General James Mattis.
Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you for that very warm welcome for the General. Mike is on now, and I was just thanking you for being here and for that warm welcome. Let's get right into it. The General has a tight schedule. He's a man in great demand right now, as he's been his whole life as a leader. So why did you write this book?
Well, you get to my color of hair, and you want to pass on the lessons you learned along the route. It's not to say that I'm going to say the right way to do something, because in some cases I did the wrong thing, and I try to be very candid about it. But you do want to pass on to young people what worked, what didn't work, and what you learned. The idea being they don't make the same mistakes I did, that they make their own mistakes. We all make mistakes. It's whether or not you learn from it. And certainly George Washington made many mistakes. He's very candid about it and confronted certainly tough times. And right now, the Regent Dee Dee, you said that it's a good time for this lecture. Well, I'd also say that a reminder, by looking at our history, the country's been through tough times, raucous times, and much more difficult times. So there's a lot to be said by following George Washington's idea of leadership. And actually, he was one of those I studied over my career, required to, I might add, by the Marine Corps, that was not interested in my midlife crisis. If I didn't feel like reading the books, I would stay in my VOQ room to read them that weekend. So they convinced me to read history, and George Washington, of course, couldn't be missed in that.
Well, let's talk a little about Washington then, instead of jumping right into your own biography. But we were just at the Washington Presidential Library. We brought out some wonderful items for you to enjoy. Talk a little about Washington. What does he mean to you as a leader, as an American leader?
He had a very, very precise way of leading. If you study George Washington, even as a young officer on the frontier, 4 words sum it up. And it sounds rather methodical or even mechanistic, but it was not. It was to listen and learn and then help and then lead. And if you keep those 4 points in mind as you look at what he's doing, as he matures as an officer, as he matures as a leader, they're not the same thing. Your troops are the ones who declare if you're a leader or not. You can have an officer's commission, but he learns to actually lead. And for example, He listens and he learns from allies. He listens and learns from a guy named Kosciuszko and a guy named Lafayette. He listens and learns from Rochambeau, von Steuben. He listens to his allies and he learns from them. And when you listen and learn from someone, you are showing them respect. So you see it ingrained in his way of approaching life. And life is life in the camp for him many times, on the frontier, here on the eastern seaboard. The next step is to help. So you listen and you learn. You really listen. You don't listen just to rebuff them or to tell them what you think. You listen and you learn, and then you help them, and then you lead. And you see this repeatedly during the worst days of the revolution, when his troops are freezing to death and Congress is adjourned without voting enough money for blankets. He has all the reasons to start sucking his thumb and saying, "Poor me." He doesn't do it. He stays steadfast, and he stays with that very methodical listen and learn and help and then lead. And he marches out of Valley Forge, and they humble the redcoats who would destroy Napoleon a few years later. It shows just how chancy it was and how much you can learn by studying leaders of the past.
We're going to talk about that. That's one of the great, I think, profound aspects of this book is the way you integrate your own memoir with your reading and your thinking about the past and its importance. But let's start where it began as a Marine for you. Why the Marine Corps?
Well, that was a rather unstudied decision. It was 1968, 69. I was in college. I was having a little more fun than the 2S deferment permitted. And as a way, we all knew we would get drafted. None of us believed they'd be brought home a few years later, the draft dodgers, and treated as heroes, so we thought we had to go. So my brother was in the Marines, and there wasn't much more thought to it. I signed up with the Marines to avoid being in the Army. Some people said I wasn't the brightest draft dodger.
One of the things I think you write well about, the role of sergeants and corporals in forming a young infantry officer.
Yeah.
Talk a little about that.
Well, down the road about 20 miles from here in Quantico, we have a place called OCS, Officer Candidate School. Largely run, probably about 75, 85% of OCS is run by sergeants, corporals, sergeants, staff sergeants, gunnies. And they're the ones who determine who's going to be allowed to be made an officer and who isn't. And so right away from your first days of getting off the bus, you're learning right up front the value of the NCOs. And I would just tell you that 40-some years later, looking back on all the fighting, John, that we've been through, combat has some very interesting and some exciting moments. But if you have good NCOs, the outcome is not in doubt. The outcome, your petty officers, your non-commissioned officers will win that fight so long as you set them up for success. In the years after OCS, a Marine infantry officer, any infantry officer, is very much carried by his NCOs. They don't expect you to do as they say, but they do expect that you'll listen. And you see right away George Washington's method of leadership coming out in the infantry to this day, the Army infantry, the Marine infantry. You listen and you learn from them, and then you help them by calling in artillery fire or air support or medevac, and then you lead them. And so it's very much consistent with the way George Washington led his Revolutionary Army, I believe, and the NCOs carry on that tradition today.
I think one of the really clear things, well, first, I love how you're very clear about what good leaders do and what mistakes you've made and that sort of thing. But one of the lessons that you come back to over and over again throughout the book is an emphasis on the leader setting the intention and allowing your team to use their aggressiveness and initiative to achieve the job. You could talk about commander's intent and how that has been manifested in your own leadership or how you learned that.
Well, you learn it in the field, of course, how you're going to lead. I mean, every service has its own culture. They teach you how to lead, and then you have to apply it according to your own unique personality. We're not a bunch of automatons. And what I realized after about a couple months in the Fleet Marine Force, I really didn't have young sailors and Marines laying on their back looking at the ceiling at night saying, I wonder how I can mess up Lieutenant Mattis's day tomorrow, you know? It took me a little while because they're kind of rambunctious, and we'd pull into port and they'd have a little too much fun, and I'd be having my heels locked at the position of attention the next day in front of the company commander. But I found that if they knew what you wanted to accomplish, if you really spent time clearly stating it and then doing clarifying and confirming, have them talk back to you, do they really understand this? You could unleash them and take your hands off the steering wheel if you brought them upright, trained them for it, and let them use the two qualities we need most in young petty officers and NCOs in the military. That's initiative and aggressiveness. But you've got to make it clear, and it's not as easy as it sounds. But at the same time, you say, my aim is this, and here's kind of how I see it developing, and at the end of the day, here's what I want you to have done. And you can put things right in there that say, by the way, you know, there's a lot of innocent women and children on this battlefield. Every battlefield is also a humanitarian field, so keep your honor clean. If taking a shot across a crowded marketplace to kill a terrorist is going to end up with a woman or child being injured, don't take the shot. And so you put that clarity out there, and then your troops take it for action. I'll give you an example. We have a line of Marines across the street. It's 124 degrees. I didn't know it got that hot on Earth until I was in the Middle East. 124 degrees. The Marines have bayonets on their rifles. We've had no trouble in this town, and we're stopping our mob, and rocks are starting to be thrown. And it's, they're angry, obviously. And you can just see what's going to happen. And the Navy chaplain and a couple of his sailors and Marines walked out into the crowd and started handing out bottles of chilled water to the people who were demonstrating. And I would never have thought of that. But they knew what our job was, to try to keep the peace, or what passed for the peace in that very hot summer of 2004, for one more week, one more day, one more hour, as we tried to get this thing on the right track. And it's very hard to throw a rock at somebody who just handed you a bottle of chilled water on a 124-degree day. Yeah. So we got a few of the leaders in. So what are you angry about? Said, we got no electricity. We said, yeah, we hate it too. We've got no air conditioning either. And the mob disappears, and they understand that we're on the same sheet of music. So I would never have thought of that technique. But because I said you've got to try and do this without any sense of triumphalism, we're there to free these people, not to conquer them, then you turn over the initiative to the subordinates, and they know what to do.
Fantastic. And we'll get to, I think, some episodes where you don't think there was clear intent and there wasn't clarity, and the mistakes that can create and the challenges that creates. But let's talk a little about the study of history and its importance to a military leader, any leader. And why does the Marine Corps require books at different ranks?
Yeah, what the doctor's talking about here is basically every time you get promoted in the Marine Corps, they say congratulations, they put a new insignia on you here. You go in and look in the mirror and say, well, that looks good, and you walk out and some sergeant says, here's your new book, let's start reading. Each rank, you have to read a new set. Even generals, when they make general, they're told a couple things. One, you'll never eat poorly again. 2, you'll never hear the truth again. 3, here's your list of books, start reading. And a couple of them are by Kissinger, and each sentence is 27 words long. You know? So the point that the Marines make is it's an imperfect way of looking at the future, but it's the only light we have for that dark path ahead. And human nature doesn't change a lot. So what they were trying to get across to us was we were responsible for our own development, for our own learning. And we would have to study this stuff. They could train us how to shoot a machine gun, how to put a wound dressing on one who's wounded, how to call for an airstrike, that sort of thing. They knew we would have to know that. They trained us to do it. They then expected us to educate ourselves what they couldn't train us for the unexpected, for the time you're laying awake in your sleeping bag trying to figure out how you're going to deal with the attack the next day, and that's where the reading paid off. It is required reading, and the surest way to probably find yourself passed over for promotion is find you did not do the reading for your rank, and that was a very effective way of motivating people to read in an age when history is not taught with the same degree of fervor in our universities that it once was.
Well, it's we'll talk a little more, I think, about that as well, but it struck me so much, connected me in your book to George Washington again. So let me read a quote from him. He's a 24-year-old colonel of the Virginia Regiment. He returns back to his regiment, and they had to do a court-martial. One of the officers wasn't behaving correctly. After the court-martial, he makes an address to the troops, and in that he says, remember, it is the actions and not the commission that make the officer, that there's more expected from him than the title. Do not forget that there ought to be a time appropriated to attain the knowledge of an officer as well as to indulge pleasure. And as we have no opportunities to improve from example, let us read for this desirable end. Then he lists out a list of books that they should all be reading.
Yeah,
Extraordinary.
Life is too short to learn everything you need to know from your own experience. You've got to read from others, and it's got a moral dimension to it for the military officers because, of course, you're telling very young men, in my case, in the infantry, that, they're called infantry for infant soldier for a reason, young soldier. When you're going to point toward them and point them toward the enemy, and they've got to go, you'd better know what you're doing. So there is the moral dimension to it that the father of our country is talking about there. But he's also showing at a young age the understanding that people have to be held to certain standards. And by that, it breaks your heart sometimes because they'll be friends of yours or something. But when they don't measure up, when they don't deliver results, then they have got to be held to a standard higher than their subordinate troops. And I used to tell young commanders who are still coming to grips with makes their position very lonely, I said, listen, there's nothing new under the sun. Even Jesus of Nazareth had 1 out of 12 go to mud on him, okay? So once in a while your selection system breaks down and you've got to impose the standards. That's all there is to it.
Yeah, I don't know how they selected Judas, so yeah, it's good. So well, let's talk about training then as well. You've been involved in training a lot of different capacities, including in command. One of the great ideas I found really compelling was the importance of simulations and really trying to equip the soldier to deal with combat without having combat experience. Can you talk a little bit about training and preparation?
Well, I think for many of us in combat, we thought if we could get a young sailor or Marine, soldier, airman, through their first 3 or 4 firefights alive, their chances for survival went up geometrically because you know how you're going to react, you know the fear you'll feel, you'll know the training kicking in, you'll have confidence in people next to you. So you try to, as much as you can with modern simulation techniques, to basically approximate the tactical and the ethical decisions you'll have to make on the battlefield. But I think, too, in Washington's time, for example, at Valley Forge, where he could have just sulked or lost his entire army as the summer soldiers deserted and the ones who could face the tough winter in New Jersey stuck with him, he used von Steuben, and they taught confidence because they would make the troops drills, and of course in those days you drilled so close to each other you could feel their shoulders on each side of you as you marched into the fight. And you were actually transmitting the confidence of your fellow soldier, and you're getting a geometric increase there of confidence because you feel, and remember, there were what the French called mulattoes. There were blacks in that army, upwards of 10 to 15%, we think. There were people who didn't speak English well, immigrants. There were people who didn't know each other in the regular army because they were from North Carolina, and the guy next to them was from Massachusetts. It wasn't just state regiments. And so what they needed to do is simulate some of combat. And when they marched out of Valley Forge that spring, they were trained to go in up against the British regulars, the most feared army on earth at the time. So there's a way to do it consistent with your time. Right now, we're taking a lot of advances out of Hollywood, frankly, and we're going to bring those in as far as simulation in the military.
That's wonderful. So let's talk about the most feared military in the world today. And let's start with the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines that you commanded in Desert Storm. Talk a little bit about that. Was that your first time commanding in battle?
Of a battalion, yes. I would just tell you that the training that we went through there, however, was about 6 days a week over the exact kind of terrain we would be fighting in. It is the last time, what I remember it most fondly for, it's the last time I brought everyone home alive. 1,350 sailors, Marines, and Arabs in the battalion. Kuwaitis who've been caught training in American military schools returned to us and now found themselves as Air Force NCOs in the Kuwaiti Air Force in a Marine infantry battalion that was going to open the way through 2 minefields. They were enthusiastic about it as the confidence of the Marines and sailors permeated them. We had people wounded, vehicles knocked out. We brought them all home alive. And one of the guys who got his ears pretty much shot off, his girlfriend wrote me a reassuring letter later saying they put a new ear on him, it looks better than the old one. You know? So I still remember it in very fond terms for the liberation of Kuwait.
That campaign was extraordinarily successful, and I think one of the things you talk about in here is the clarity of leadership at all levels, and the strategic sense that it was clear what the intent was coming from the top, that it was a diplomatic success, it was a political success with all the coalition that was put together, and then the actual execution of it. It seems like as we get closer to the present in your book, we don't see a lot of that coherence on all the different levels in strategy and execution.
Well, I worry about the teaching of strategy, military history, and all the Western democracies right now. We're not the only ones who have strategic challenges thinking strategically. But think back to 1990 when in the first days of Iraq moving in and subjugating, invading, conquering Kuwait, President Bush says, "This will not stand." That's actually one of the last things I heard before I left the state, because we were up in the Sierra Nevadas climbing mountains. I was told to go back, change into desert uniforms back in Southern California, and we flew out immediately. Over the months, we were on the defensive, and it was very clear that they would not be allowed to invade Saudi Arabia. And then we basically were beefed up, and President Bush said, "I want this done quickly," and they said, "Well, it'll probably take us, 300,000 troops or something for, or 250,000 for 3, 4, 5, 6 months." He said, "No." He said, "Here's more troops. I want it done quickly." We go in and we do it. We free Kuwait, and at that point, from the political right in Washington, it's march on Baghdad. He said, "No, we're not going to do that. We're not going to have mission creep. We're not going to lose the coalition." He'd aligned the entire world against Saddam. We even had the Russians slipping us information, believe it or not, about the radars they'd sold Saddam back in those days. That's how much confidence he had created in the world that we were going to deal with this. And then he said, "Iraq is a bulwark against Iran. We're not going to Baghdad. We may not like him, but we're not going to widen the war. We're there for one reason, free Kuwait." We did it. We came home, and it shows that he knew how to keep mission creep under control, but at the same time, we accomplished the mission because he gave us everything we needed plus more.
Well, it's an extraordinary story. Talk about the strategic leadership training that you've been through. You were at the National War College, I understand. Mm-hmm. We have the Commandant of the National War College here today. There he is, right there. And talk about the National War College and what you learned there, if anything.
I remember getting grilled one day by the brand new Secretary of Defense, Don Rumsfeld, and I kind of pointed out to him I was just at the Pentagon on an athletic scholarship myself. I was in great physical condition, General, when I was at your school, okay? It was a great physical workout place. But I think it's more important that the National War College be seen as part of the continuum of an officer's growth, like George Washington. And if an officer at age 24 isn't already reading, then he's never going to be able to help his troops the way a good commander can. So the National War College is what I think we still call it the Harvard of the military education system. It's a wonderful place for reflection, study, that sort of thing. But also, I turn to a lot of people, and there's a lesson in this. The guys I would turn to for strategic advice by the time I was a senior general were guys like Kissinger, Newt Gingrich. We didn't get into politics. He's a historian. George Shultz, Colin Powell, Colin Gray from Reading University, Hugh Strawn from Oxford University, an Army general by the name of John Abizaid, one of my former commanders. And notice I did not mention just now a single serving U.S. military or foreign service officer. That should be a big concern to everybody in this room, that I'm turning to people that I'm younger than in order to get strategic advice. It's a big concern in our universities. I agree with teaching about the powerless and studying the history of the powerless and those who have been disadvantaged. But we better also study the powerful if we want to deal with this world such as it is. We can all see the storm clouds gathering, and we're going to need better strategic thinking in the future than we've seen in the Western democracies, plural, by the way. This is not a uniquely American problem. The Western democracies appear to have gotten to the point of such an overweening sensitivity about warfare that they don't want to study it. It'd be like you walked into a medical school, ladies and gentlemen, and they said, well, we don't study cancer because that's really bad stuff. You say, are you nuts? You'd better study cancer if you want to avoid it. And remember what the military's job is up here. It is to try to keep the peace, deter war for one more year, one more month, one more week, one more day again, so that the diplomats can work their magic, so that our diplomats are listened to with respect. And that's what the military's job is, and we'd better do a lot better job at strategizing so we don't win battles and have inconclusive wars.
I guarantee that all you graduated from a college here could call up your alma mater and ask them who's teaching military history this semester, and they would say, well, we're not offering that course because it hasn't been taught in colleges and universities in this country regularly for a generation. And not only that, diplomatic history as well, and economic history. All the fundamental things that you need to have a framework to think strategically and that you have to build over time. So if you want to have an impact, call up your president of your university and don't give them another dime until they start teaching military history there. Meanwhile, give it to Mount Vernon because we do teach it here. All right.
Well put, Peg, well put.
So one of the things I was confused about, because as a sad civilian historian, I thought the Marines were an amphibious force. Afghanistan is a landlocked country. How did you convince people to take Task Force 58 hundreds of miles into southern Afghanistan?
Well, that wasn't hard, actually. You remember after 9/11, there's not an intelligence officer or military officer in the U.S. that didn't feel like we'd let you down. They never should have gotten through, slaughtering nearly 3,000 innocent people in New York and Washington. By the way, citizens of innocent people from 91 countries, just to show you how international that attack was. So we're out there. I was with about a half dozen Marines. I was slipped into Bahrain.
What is a task force? What is Task Force 58?
You're given a task, you organize a force for it. It can be 15 Army Green Berets, it can be 10 Navy ships with 10,000 Marines on it. It can be 3 aircraft carriers. So whatever the task is, you organize a force for it, you give it a number. And ours was Task Force 58. Bottom line is the admiral calls me in. I'm a 1-star, he's a 3-star. And some admirals worry me, sorry, shipmates. But Admiral Willie Moore, the fleet commander, if it was 150 years ago, he'd have an eye patch on one eye and a Jolly Roger at the masthead waving a sword, you know. And he calls me in, he says, look, the Green Berets, the CIA, they've got them on the run at Mazar-e-Sharif up north. They're going to fall back on Kabul. He'd done his homework. He said, nobody's held Kabul in 500 years. So they're going to fall back on Kandahar, which is their spiritual home. And then he looks me in the eyes, pointing at a map. He says, can you get the Marines from the Mediterranean Fleet and the Pacific Fleet together and launch 350 nautical miles over the top of Pakistan and move against Kandahar, isolate it, and then move against it and take it? I say, yep, I can do that. And he said, okay. He says, go write some orders, whatever I got to send to Tampa, to Washington, and I'll give you an airplane so you can go circle. And I'm going to show you how good it was. The Marines have made me read all those books. And for you young officers, I'm going to tell you how to make 4-star general or admiral, so take notes here, okay? We're up there circling at night in a Navy anti-submarine plane, which you can see anything. You can see a periscope at 20 miles, so you can imagine how good that airplane is to look at the battles. And I could see the fighting up north and the cars coming out of there as they were retreating, see the fighting over on the Pakistani border. And then I saw this big dark patch of ground south of Kandahar. And I knew exactly, as clearly as I can see you, I could see how I was going to nail them. And I didn't care how brave the troops were, I didn't care how many tanks they had or anything else. I'd read enough things to know exactly what I was looking at right there. So the clue is, fight enemy generals dumber than a bucket of rocks, okay? And you'll get promoted. It wasn't that hard, but thanks to Marines in the 1950s who brought KC-130 tanker airplanes into the Marine inventory. Thanks to Marines in the 1970s, 80s who brought in light armored vehicles and air refuelable helicopters. And thanks to the Marine Corps that toughened up its boot camp in the 1990s because the young lads we were getting in, gals we were getting in, were not as physically tough as we needed, so we extended the boot camp. They were tough enough for it. And then the training that we put those units through, all I did was benefit from what people had done from literally the decade when I'd been born and on through, because they built this machine, this Navy Marine machine. And the result was we flew in, and there was nothing they could do about it. With the help of the CIA, the Air Force Special Tactics folks, the Navy and Marine pilots off the carriers, it wasn't that hard to do either. I could have gone further. That was just where I wanted to go, is where we went.
Well, it's an extraordinary part of the book, and also the beginning for me as a reader of a very frustrating section of the book where opportunities that had emerged were lost.
Oh,
and
yeah.
one of them was Tora Bora, and your idea is to seal off the passes so that Osama bin Laden could not escape into Pakistan. Talk a little about that idea and how you imagined it could have been done.
Well, it's interesting. Our CIA had, let me just say, our intelligence had told us where Osama bin Laden was. We knew he would try to get out to Pakistan, but he wasn't gone yet. This is early after 9/11, early after we'd gone into Afghanistan before Christmas of 2001. And so I recalled from my reading how the U.S. Army had fought Geronimo on the southwest border using heliograph stations which were in sight of each other so they could monitor any marauding Native American bands coming across the border out of Mexico where they were hiding out. So I called back to Maryland, where the Marine Corps intelligence activity was. Within 24 hours, those well-rested intelligence people not out in the field were able to identify, if they were only in one of two valleys, and we were very confident that's where Osama bin Laden was, we could put Marine outposts along certain mountaintops and they could see each other from one to another, and then we'd just push up the two valleys and we'd make sure we got him. I did all that, had it all set to go, but what I failed to do, I'd come out from underneath Army command or Navy command and control. I'd shifted to Army, and I had not spent time briefing my new boss, who was some 1,800 miles away, by radio, and I didn't keep him informed of the developing opportunity and the capability we had to go in and block the passes and get him. And so that's one of the lessons I learned. You've got to keep your boss informed when you're doing something. By the time we had broached it to them and it had been argued about and this sort of thing, Osama bin Laden had gotten over the border into Pakistan.
I love that lesson, and you come back to it in other places as well. This your own critique of yourself as a leader there, rather than complaining that, oh, these guys above me ruined this for us. You put it on yourself that it's your job to convince people to see the situation that you see. And I think all of us as leaders, I've got a board. I'd struggle with trying to convince the board to see things the way I see them. Where's Dee Dee? She knows that. But I think that's you don't see that in leadership books at all, really. It's often, it's downward focusing and much less about that need to communicate up the chain.
Yeah, as a leader, I don't think you really get the opportunity to say it's someone else's fault. There's got to be something you could have done differently. We're not victims in this world, no matter how much, in America we seem to be exalting victimhood lately. You're not a victim. You can always create options. That's one thing that the Marines teach you very young. You basically, you improvise, you adapt, and you overcome. And I should have been on the phone earlier. I should have done it right from the first day we shifted command. I still commanded the ships at sea under the Navy Admiral, but for the troops ashore, I was now under a general, and I had not spent the time doing what my duty required me to do. So it was my failure.
You're critical of the Iraq War for a number of directions. I was astonished by the lack of guidance you received about the aftermath of the combat phase of the war, a lack of a sense that there was planning about the occupation, so that was up to you all to do a lot of that thinking because you would be there on the ground. You're critical about the de-Baathization, the immediate elections, and the decision to disband the Iraqi army. Mm-hmm. There seemed to be a real lack of clarity of intent in that part of that mission coming from the top?
Well, part of it was the difficulty. You'll remember there was an insistence that Saddam allow the UN inspectors in. Remember, it wasn't just the U.S. military. The U.S. intelligence thought he had weapons of mass destruction. His own generals believed that he had them and told us if they got any closer than the Tigris River with their units, he would have gassed them. It's one of the ways he kept control. The Kuwaitis thought he had chemical weapons. The Israelis thought he had them. So we know that there was a lot going on at the UN, but we did not know, General Kelly, I believe, when we crossed the line of departure, we still did not know if we were going to Baghdad. We knew we were to seize the oil fields, but we literally crossed the line of departure, and we don't know how far we're going. Now, we've planned for it. We've planned for Baghdad and even beyond. Fortunately, we did, because General Kelly had to take a third of the division even beyond Baghdad. But I would just tell you that gaining that clarity is sometimes very difficult, and you have to deal with it as a military officer. However, there were some things that were just unwise. Coming off those very hot days in the summer, I remember a first lieutenant, probably not 3 years out of his undergraduate school, intelligence officer, and walking into a great big cavernous palace where we'd set up the division headquarters. And he, when they were briefing me, he said, by the way, we hear they're going to disband the Iraqi army. And we'd gotten them back into the barrack. We'd started paying them little bits of money so they could feed their families. We'd actually had some meetings with them saying, what was it like fighting us compared to fight when you fought the Iranians, starting to try to restore their sense of pride that we weren't there to crush their spirits. And I said, don't pay attention to rumors there, Lieutenant. Let's talk about what's real here. No one's going to be that stupid. The next day, I walked in and I heard all the chairs in the room being pushed back. Usually what they do when you walk into a headquarters like that, they say 3 words, General on deck. That way they stop telling general officer jokes, you know what I mean? This time, they're all standing up when they say General on deck, and so I know something's going on. I walk down this thing, and there's the lieutenant standing there. He holds up one piece of paper. It's got 3 sentences on it. Iraqi Army's disbanded. First lieutenant, less than 25 years old, says, General, we just started an insurgency. First lieutenant, wisdom. Right there. It was not hard to see what we had just started. So you got to, again, you've got to really know what you're going into, and you've got to study it. And if you don't understand the culture, and by that I mean not just the history, you better understand their music and their dance. You better understand their myths. You better understand what they're proud of in their history. If you don't understand the history and the culture of a place, then you're going in unarmed into a fight, and it's not going to be pleasant for you.
Well, one of the chapters which are brilliant in here, but indeed very difficult, I think, is the story when you arrived back in Anbar province in January of 2004, and the challenges of Fallujah. And particularly, I like the way you write about that we lost the moral high ground in the period there. You talk a little bit, you very much were against the military response to the killing of the contractors that had been on CNN and had outraged everyone in this country. Talk a little bit about that. If you don't mind, let me quote from you here. These contractors' bodies were displayed after being mutilated, and General Mattis writes, "The defilement of the human body affronts our sense of dignity. And after a reference to Homer and Achilles," this is in your book, after you reference Homer and Achilles debasing the body of Hector, you write, "In Fallujah, our military strength would be guided by moral power, just as it has been since George Washington first commanded our Continental Army. By killing those who had violated that great rule. But you thought that the assault, the military assault on this city was the wrong way to go about dealing with it."
Well, we were operating under a troop cap. We didn't have enough troops. We were covering an area the size of North Carolina, I think, with about 11,000 troops. And the enemy was surging at that point. And I knew a way. Fallujah was a tribal town, which means there's different tribal elements. And there were some that were quite willing to help us hunt down the people. We had pictures of who had done it. We knew we could find who had done it from the other tribal elements, and we'd hunt them down and we'd kill them. But I did not want to assault a city of over 300,000 people, have to evacuate it first, and knowing what urban combat is like, I wanted to try and do it a different way. I was ordered to attack. Bottom line, we had only 2 assault battalions to put into the fight initially, and we were pulling others in. And one of the Army Division commanders, Marty Dempsey, turned his division around and relieved me in certain places so that we could pull more Marines up into the fight. But it was a tough fight. And when we got into it, the information war by the enemy was very effective. They showed us using artillery fire in Fallujah. I'd have used it if we needed it, but in fact we never fired 1 artillery round into Fallujah in the first Battle of Fallujah, not one. And yet the stringers who showed it and passed those films on to international news media made it look like the Marines were a bunch of cowboys just going in laying waste to a town. Believe it or not, one of the news media that was harshest with us was from another country, and the actual pictures were taken from a city where their troops were located. But we got beat on the information war, and then around that time too, the pictures, photos of the Abu Ghraib prison thing came out.
In a critical moment, at a critical moment in this.
It was.
Yeah.
And so now you have an enemy that says, look, the Marines were stopped deep inside the city. I did put one caveat when I said, okay, I'm going to do it. You know, that's why they're called orders, ladies and gentlemen, not likes. You don't have to like it. You know, they're orders. I'll do it, but don't stop us once we start. And deep inside the city, the information campaign that they mount, the enemy mounts, stops us deep inside the city. Then eventually, after negotiating, we had to pull back. And now they could say, besides these bad, very bad things that happened at Abu Ghraib, which we should be held accountable for, we were also shown that they had stopped the U.S. Marines. And so months later, when we had to attack again, the enemy now had time to fortify the houses, put more ammunition in. We lost a lot of good boys, Army, Navy, Marine, going in there, taking it back.
It's a very powerful chapter. Let's flash forward a little bit to your time at CENTCOM Command. You felt that the region did not have a unifying strategy.
You know, this is starting to feel like waterboarding.
It's not effective. There's a lot in here. This is good stuff.
You actually read the book.
Well, the first pages are like you have to read if you're an intelligent person, so I had to get through it. You know, you start saying people are illiterate if they haven't read hundreds of books. But you were frustrated at CENTCOM with the idea, you know, that there wasn't a unifying strategy. We had troops all over the place, and you had you're flying around trying to build relationships with people, and ultimately, I mean, it gets back to this question of, you know, are we as a society, are our institutions producing really clear strategic thinking, and is it being deployed?
Well, I think what happens is you kind of get caught up in the urgency of the moment, and with modern information systems, you get flooded with so many tactical details, you forget that at some levels you just need to leave that to the young officers. If you've trained them, then leave them alone. Make certain you get the strategy right, make very clear what it is you're trying to accomplish, and then ensure that you're giving them the feedback on the feedback loop, that they're feeding to you what's going on, and you adapt it, but don't lose sight, as Martin Luther King Jr. put it, keep your eye on the ball, on the objective. Don't take your eye off the objective. And leadership is leadership, whether you're in civil rights or war. It's the same sort of thing. And in this case, what concerned me was I could not tell what the policy was, what it was supposed to look like at the end. You know, what I knew for example, I knew we did not want Iran to have a nuclear weapon, and I agree with that. I know that we didn't want Iran to block the shipping of oil when 40% of the spot market oil goes out through the Straits of Hormuz. What I didn't know is what did we want the relationship with Iran to look like at the end of the day. So you have a military, which is a pretty brittle instrument, is working on things, and they don't really know how that nests inside the broader foreign policy. And it goes back, you know, can I wander off that for just a second?
Yeah, of course.
You know, I get called to become the, nominated to be the Secretary of Defense. I never met Mr. Trump before. We have an interview, and I disagree with him a couple times. It's all in the book there in that first couple pages. And I thought, well, back to Stanford, you know, here we go. Life's good west of the Rockies. And then he says, I'm going to be the Secretary of Defense, and he's going to nominate me. And so right after Christmas that year, I flew into D.C., and I heard that Rex Tillerson was in town, the nominee to be Secretary of State. So I called him up. And I said, I've never met you before. Why don't we have dinner? He said, sure. So two old guys sitting in the back of a restaurant, 28 December, pretty empty town up there that time of year. And we're just getting to know each other. You know, Texas guy, dad delivered milk in a milk truck, works his way through college, Eagle Scout, becomes an engineer for ExxonMobil, rises to the top, been all around the world, lived in Yemen, been to Russia. I'm telling you, I'm a Marine guy, you know. And I said, you know, over my 40-some years career, there have been times Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense didn't even talk to each other. They just didn't get along. And I said, our country paid a price for that. And I said, I think we've militarized our foreign policy. I think you need to be in the driver's seat. I will inform you of the military factors. I'll be very blunt. I won't hold anything back. I'll tell you what I can do, what I can't do. But I said, we need you and your diplomats in the driver's seat of our foreign policy. Because that's the way it's got to be. This is America, and we've got two powers, power of inspiration, power of intimidation. And sometimes you need the power of intimidation, but we really need the power of inspiration. And that's where our diplomats, seeing a better world, can keep allies gathered to our side. And so he just reached over the table at that point, and I said, let's shake on it. And he reached over, and we said we're going to meet every week, which we did when we were in town. We had breakfast together in his office. We worked everything out. We didn't have to go into the White House arguing state and defense. Went in, combined, and laid out this is our position, doing what public servants and governance should be doing as far as I'm concerned, nothing special. But I bring it up, ladies and gentlemen, because strategy is a lot more than war. It's a lot more than military. It's a whole lot more than that. I mean, what would happen if we were bringing young students from the Middle East to this center right here and putting them through a week or two, just bring, and then, by the way, trading email addresses with the ones from Morocco and the ones from Jordan and the ones from Saudi, so they could come here and see how something else works and then go home. Maybe something to it, you know?
Absolutely. It'd be nice if we could emulate the way it should be done. So quickly then, on the importance of allies, you're powerful about the importance of allies. Talk a little bit about your experience with allies and why they matter so much.
Well, if you go back to George Washington, I mean, if just go down to Yorktown sometime, and if you stand where the British would have been standing, looking out from Yorktown, surrounded now, and just praying their fleet will get there before the French. Didn't work for them. They didn't pray enough, I guess. But if you look at the battlements out there, you'll see a star, and then you see the Cross of Lorraine and the Cross of Lorraine. And George Washington understood right away why we needed allies. I mean, Kosciuszko was a veteran soldier from Poland. Von Steuben was from Prussia. Of course, Lafayette, Rochambeau are from France. I can go on. We had allies come in and help us. The French army was a professional army. Rochambeau thought the world of Washington, not because Washington knew everything. Rochambeau had been a veteran of many campaigns. What he saw in Washington was a man who could learn and really adapt and lead the Revolutionary Army. And you put that together, remember, we had a Continental Army, Continental Navy, Continental Marines before we had a country. And from our very beginnings, allies have been critical to our nation's survival. So I just see myself in the continuing tradition of how we look at allies, and history is very, very clear to me, not just about America. Nations with allies thrive, and nations without them die. So, you know, real simple. The Marines have put it more bluntly, I think. They say if you're going to a gunfight, bring all your friends with guns. You know? But it's the same idea. Come together with like-minded nations. You won't agree with everything. I'm sure FDR agreed with doggone little of Joseph Stalin, other than let's defeat Hitler. But my point is, in an imperfect world, we need allies.
Well, you quote Churchill on that question. You want to take it?
Well, go ahead.
The only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without allies.
It is hard. It is hard because you speak different languages. But as I used to tell my American officers at U.S. Central Command, where we had 70 other nations on my staff of U.S. Central Command, not all the good ideas come from the country with the most aircraft carriers. So listen up. You can listen, learn, help them, and then lead. Same idea, very methodical. George Washington had it right.
You call America a great big experiment. What does that mean to you, and what does that mean for us?
Well, you know, we're trying to build a country here. We're not done with it. You know, we're trying to build one, and it's very, very hard work. The Constitution was designed to be hard after that very nasty argument with King George III. We didn't want it easy. We didn't want to replace a king with a form of government that would dominate us. So we said we're going to make 3 co-equal branches, and we're going to see if we can, and by the way, just add a little more problem to it. We'll give one of those branches a bicameral legislature. And by the way, all of them have to work together to govern. But the Constitution's a very hardy document. What is not so hardy is this experiment. And we're going to have to rediscover our fundamental friendliness and respect for one another. And respect, I think, goes to how George Washington did it again. Listen and learn. That's how you respect. No contempt for someone with a different idea. Actually, once in a while, the people who disagree with you might be right. And I keep telling myself that. But to me, it's an experiment that we have an obligation. Most of us in this room, for example, we were born here. Those who immigrated here, you're here like all the rest of us by choice. But we have a responsibility to the next generation to pass these freedoms on as soundly as we received them. And we just have to look and say that includes fiscal freedom. Are we really taxing ourselves enough so we're not increasing the debt for young people that we're just going to pass over to them in what I would call intergenerational theft? I mean, are we really governing? It seems like all we're doing is dividing. I understand we have to divide when we run for election. I'm smart, you're not. You try and say, well, you're right, I'm wrong. Okay, we die. Finally, you guys vote. Okay, I lose. Okay, at this point, everybody who voted for me, we got to roll up our sleeves and work with the guys who voted for him, and because governing takes unity. Elections are dividing. That's okay. That's democracy. Sometimes it's not very civil. That's okay, a little raucous. But when it's over, we go back to governing. Governing is about unifying, and that's the experiment that it worries me right now.
Fantastic. Now, I want to end with a little special treat for everybody here and for yourself. I'm going to get this clicker over here, and I've got a few images I'd like to show, if I can get this thing to work. It's on, okay. So behind us here, we can turn a little bit, General, if you don't mind. One of the things that you did when you started as Secretary of Defense is you asked for the strategy. Where's the strategy? And you rewrote and wrote a strategy with a lot of help, I'm sure. But one of the aspects of it was you point out that China is a competitor of the United States. And we had to think clearly about how to deal and interact and engage with China. And one of the wonderful things you did was you brought a number of Chinese to Mount Vernon about a year ago in November. And if you would you care to talk a little bit about what you had in mind in that visit? And I'm going to click through some images here. So they're arriving by helicopter there. Mm-hmm. And then there you are, I think.
This is me on the left, General Wei with his hand up. And, we've met before. We're friendly in the sense of the man-to-man relationship.
That's on the piazza at Mount Vernon.
This is General Wei. He is their Minister of Defense. In their country, it is a general. In our country, it is not.
Does anybody notice who's in the back corner of this photograph? I'm not talking about the general back. I'm talking about me. I'm right there. I'm trying to button it in because the general's coming in. So, getting ready. Okay, then we're inside. Talk about that guy.
Well, what I wanted to do, ladies and gentlemen, was make sure that my counterpart understood how a real revolutionary general handles leadership. And so I wanted him to come here to Mount Vernon with about 40 of his staff. Right after he meets with General Washington, he and I go for a walk out in the woods. The general and I have a very straightforward talk. But what I was trying to do is I pointed out the key to the Bastille that Lafayette gave to General Washington. It still hangs in the house up here, thanks to the ladies of Mount Vernon who defend this place against anyone who would think that they can in any way modify or adapt it to modern circumstance or something. And I wanted to show that in real revolutionary regimes, you free political prisoners, like the French did, like we don't have. I just wanted to make some very blunt statements. I'm not paid to be subtle, you know what I mean? But it's also an effort to do something that I think was essential, and that is between our two militaries, make very clear if we don't want to go down the road of Europe in the 20th century and engulf the world in a war, then we'd better figure out a way for two nuclear-armed superpowers to deal with each other, with our differences when we have them. We're going to have to figure out how to manage our differences as they come into their own. Cooperate, collaborate, I'm happy to do that wherever we can, but also confront where we must. And so the idea was to open communication over this very beautiful dinner that your folks put on for us here, Doc, to try to create that sort of an environment.
This is in the greenhouse at Mount Vernon, a dinner with, you had 15 leading American civilian and military leaders, and they had 15 Chinese, I think, or something like that.
I did a little more than that.
Beautiful night. And who are these folks here? That's
the West Point Choir came down. What was interesting is they introduced some of the songs with the cadets speaking Mandarin. The cadets would step forward, no translation. They're the cadets who are studying Chinese language up at West Point, which sent a message in itself.
That was extraordinary. There's no way you're going to, have a Western-looking person come out talking English in the Chinese military when you visit there. I'm losing my mic. So, and then why are these guys there?
Well, we also want to just remind them there's the other side of the military.
Yeah, they look good. The silent drill team, unbelievable.
Yeah, just a little welcome to us, yes.
Fantastic. Well, it was a beautiful evening. Let's all give the general a big round of applause.